although you can always reference the event webpage for a longer biography on him and all of the speakers that you're going to see here today. Matt is currently the McDevitt Professor of Computer Science and Law at Georgetown University. His current work seems to involve, from an outside perspective, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, getting trolled on Twitter about election security, and basically talking and educating people about all of the things that he has developed through years and years of research and experimentation, deep expertise. He's also probably one of the key people to thank for the fact that we're not all walking around today with a small thing called a clipper chip in all of our electronic devices. So thanks for joining us here today, Matt, and welcome to you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Amy, for that very generous introduction, and for the invitation to come here. First of all, is my audio coming through okay? If somebody can confirm that on the chat, that would be great. Okay, I'm just going to assume that you can hear me. Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the early history of the crypto wars, and talk a little bit about an alternative history to this. I apologize, I'm going to share some slides for a few minutes, but hopefully we'll get through that relatively quickly. But I want to focus a little bit on what a perspective that I think has been largely ignored in the current debate, and actually even in the first debate, which is just how ignorant we are of how technology is likely to go. And in particular, what I want to look at is the question: what if we had lost Crypto War I? That is, what if things had gone exactly as the government had intended, and in 1993, the Clipper chip was just quickly embraced by everyone as clearly the obvious Solomon-like solution to all of our problems? Where would that put us today? So the timeline that I'm talking about, and the kind of nomenclature that I'm using, is that there are either two and a half, or three crypto wars in our history that are of concern to us. The first was Crypto War I, which was concerned with the Clipper chip, and more broadly with export controls on cryptography. The second crypto war happened after a period of maybe 10 years of détente, in which essentially everyone just forgot about the first crypto war and tried to have all of the same debates again. And it kind of got nowhere for a while, and then somewhere around 2015 or so was replaced by what's probably going to be remembered as Crypto War III, the crypto war to end all crypto wars, which has focused particularly on content scanning on user devices, CSAM materials, and so on. But I'm not going to talk about either of those last two so much. I want us to remember the Great Crypto War before we knew that it would be necessary to number them. So Crypto War I think, is the period from around 1992 or 1993, depending on whether you look at the public or the secret world, to 2000, when there was a kind of decisive peace treaty signed. It all started in 1992, or it came to a head in 1992, when AT&T, the company that I worked for, although I worked for the part of the company that cost money, this was produced by the part of the company that made money, or tried to make money, they released this telephone device. and it was called the TSD 3600. And that stood for Telephone Security Device Model 3600. And that was essentially an encrypting phone that would sit between your handset, this is back when phones had separate handsets, and the body of your phone. Essentially, it had two buttons, one marked clear, and the other was just a red button. Clear would just let you use your handset in the normal way. If you pushed the red button, what it would do was do some sort of cleverness with the interface and essentially set up a modem connection with a peer device on the other end, and it would then do a Diffie-Hellman key exchange and show the hash of the key on the screen, and then do a DES encrypted, data encryption standard encrypted voice conversation over that modem link. So essentially, it was a way of encrypting your phone calls over an analog connection, which is all anybody really had back in 1992. Now, this device was marketed by AT&T in a way that seemed almost, designed to make it seem like a ridiculous product. First of all, its list price was $1,400 each, and you needed at least two of them for this to make any sense to own one. Which is, and this is $1992. So this was crazily expensive to start with. In fact, I think they sold, a couple hundred of them to mostly to paranoid crazies. But in spite of the fact that this phone was, not likely to be successful, at least in this form, it resulted in a complete freakout on the part of the government. Essentially, they worried, perhaps with some justification, perhaps not, that this device would become cheaper and become very popular and would make wiretaps, which looked kind of like this. Wiretaps actually involved tapping a phone mechanically and sending, a tap in the wire back to headquarters. This would essentially make wiretapping obsolete. So it very quickly tried to develop something to either convince AT&T to stop selling these devices or modify them in a way that wouldn't make wiretaps obsolete. And what they came up with was this, called the MYK78 chipset. And essentially, the MYK78, popularly known as the Clipper chip, was designed to be a drop-in replacement for a DES hardware encryption chip. It had kind of similar pinouts and a similar software interface. It used, a 64-bit encrypted block in the same way, and it had the same idea of initialization vectors, and so on and so on. So you could relatively easily take a product that used a DES chip and replace it with one of these Clipper chips without too much difficulty. And it had two important features. The first important feature is it used a brand new cipher algorithm called skipjack. And skipjack was designed by the National Security Agency in secret, and the algorithm itself was secret. But it was, kind of advertised as being designed by the same people who designed the encryption used to protect, our nation's most important classified secrets. And one way in which it was sort of measurably more secure is, unlike DES, which had a 56-bit key, kind of showing its age, Skipjack had an 80-bit key, which was considerably more secure and was designed to be secure, well into the foreseeable future and beyond, at least against exhaustive search. So that was the carrot. The stick was that if you didn't include this, you wouldn't ever be able to export your product. Oh, and it had one other feature that, they thought maybe no one would notice, but they didn't try to hide it. And that's that it would also send an encrypted copy of your key as part of the key exchange in a way that the government could decrypt it using essentially keys that were held for each chip in escrow by the government. This was, as it turns out, very controversial. And it set off a kind of immediate discussion in the world that, wait a minute, do we really want to build wiretap-ready telephones? This was very, very controversial. And in fact, the argument was mostly focused around the question, can we trust these people to keep these keys secret and not misuse them and abuse them outside of the legal process? So this was very, very controversial, and it really was acted as kind of a denial of service attack against the cryptography community, because while we should have been designing new cryptography and figuring out how to integrate new cryptography into the emerging standards of, that would become the foundation for the internet and the web that was just starting to become a thing, we spent all of our time arguing about this instead. Or a big part of our time arguing about this instead, myself included. Now, I personally had just finished grad school when this all came out, and just started a job, a kind of dream job at Bell Laboratories, which was a division of AT&T, which had another division that was actually producing the first product that would use the Clipper chip. They essentially recalled the TSD 3600s and replaced them with a version that included Clipper. I was sort of inadvertently a little bit in the middle of this. I thought, wow, this Clipper chip is a terrible idea. Nobody should use it. And I was very public in saying that. And then I found out, oh, actually, the company I work for is the first customer for this thing that I had said was terrible. But fortunately, I worked for Bell Labs, which at the time encouraged people to actually engage with the research community and be honest about their technical opinions, which was actually very refreshing, particularly considering this was basically my first job. So Clipper used this classified algorithm, and that meant that the cryptography had to be implemented in classified hardware. That you could buy these chips, but they had tamper-resistant features in them intended to prevent reverse engineering of what the actual cipher algorithm was. So the effect was that you couldn't implement this in software. You had to buy the hardware in order to do any encryption. And they produced a couple of versions of this. One was the Clipper chip, intended for integration into devices like the telephone security device. They also produced something called the Tessera card, which they later had to rename because it turned out there was a trademark on Tessera. And so they had to quickly rebrand all of them, which was a PCM-CIA card. I'll get to what that was in a second, that you could plug into a computer and essentially use as a coprocessor to perform your encryption for you. There was a central key database and that was maintained by the government, and that's really where most of the focus of the debate around this was. Can we trust the maintainers of this key database to actually secure it? It also turned out to be easily bypassed. So I discovered really in the first day of looking at this, somehow the NSA agreed to give me a sample of the PCMCIA card. And they invited me down to NSA, and I got to go in and got a little bit of a tour. And then they handed me a bag with a PCMCIA card reader and a couple of the Forteza cards. And they said, feel free to go play with them. And kind of on the first day, I figured out a way of using it in a way that bypassed the key escrow feature, and but still used the good 80-bit cipher. And that, kind of helped to derail it, but it really wasn't the problem. It was a very simple technical hack. If I hadn't discovered it, somebody else absolutely surely would have. But it would also have been relatively easy to fix had this been something that there was any real demand for. So Clipper had technical weaknesses, but they weren't the real problem. So we finally won the crypto wars in 2020. The Clinton administration finally basically got rid of the stick and agreed to allow non-escrowed cryptography to be exported, and allowed for the market to just introduce unescrowed cryptography into standards. And it cost us 7 or 8 years of arguing about this, but in the end we were finally able to get to work and securing the web and the internet and all of the things that we're seeing today. So we finally won. But what I want to look at is the question of, what if we hadn't won? What if it had gone a little bit differently? So there were 2 big risks with Clipper. And one was, can we trust the system if it works properly? That is, can we trust that the key escrow database would only be used for the stated purpose of enabling, wiretaps with warrants? And that was chiefly a political and policy question, a really difficult political and policy question, but it didn't really have to do, it kind of assumed that the technology worked properly. And then there was a second question, which is, this whole thing was designed in secret. Can we trust that it will work properly? Can we trust that there isn't some backdoor way of getting to access to this key escrow database? Might someone break into it? Might there be some weakness in the algorithm that would allow somebody to easily break Clipper encrypted conversations? Or, was there some way to bypass the system? And, as a member of the technical community, and I think most of my cryptography peers, were really focused on that question. So, the 2 big risks are, what if it works properly but is misused? And the other is, what if it's got a flaw in it that allows it to be misused by others? But actually, there was a third, much worse risk that really we hadn't thought about very much, which is, what if Clipper had been a great success? What if we figured out a way to ensure that the key escrow database would not be misused? I don't know how we would do that, but let's assume somehow we were convinced that the only way you could get access to this would be with a proper warrant, and that we were all happy with that as a proposition. What if, and there hadn't been any technical flaws or anything like that, what if Clipper had just been a big success, and this became the cryptography standard that we all used as the US government had hoped, and somehow all of the international problems of, why should people outside the US use this? What if everybody just decided, yeah, this is the right thing to do, we all trust the US government, and we all trust this database, and nothing went wrong? What if it had succeeded? And I would argue that would have resulted in a far worse outcome for us today than we would have had any of the things we were worried about come to fruition. So in order to understand why I would say something like this, I want to go back to 1993. In 1993, the word crypto wasn't really one anybody had heard about, but to the extent anybody had heard it, it still meant cryptography. We were discussing crypto policy on a Usenet news group, which was like a message board that everybody on the internet had access to, called sci.crypt. And when we wanted to share papers and results and documents and things like that, we did it via something called the FTP protocol. And that was true because at that point the web really did not exist. It had just been sort of proposed. A few people had early web browsers, but it wasn't really anything that anyone heard of. Certainly nobody confused the web with the internet back then, because most people hadn't even heard of the web to the extent that it was there. Mostly the internet meant the compact discs that AOL regularly sent out in the mail to people that you could use to load the AOL software on your Windows 3.1 machine, or you could use it as a coaster or have fun microwaving it. So most of the people that were online were using proprietary services like AOL that they reached via dial-up modem. Fax machines were still incredibly important and were largely more important than things like email for business-to-business communication. And in fact, there was a third Clipper chip product, although they never actually brought it to market, which was the encrypted fax machine, because I think they understood that you couldn't really be taken seriously as a communication device unless you supported fax. The future of telecommunications was ISDN, which allowed for a kind of native 64-bit connection with two channels, so 128 kilobits of incredibly high-speed data to your home, and that was really regarded as the future of high-speed data. Cell phones existed back then, but they were mostly an expensive luxury, and they were incredibly awkward and clunky. They still mostly had models that were designed to be installed in your car. We still hadn't figured out back then that telephones were associated with people rather than with places. So this idea of of communication and of wiretapping and what you were securing was really place to place rather than person to person. And this idea of mobile computing wasn't something that anyone other than crazy visionaries really thought about. No one knew anything about Edward Snowden back in 1993. In particular, the NSA had a few leaks come out of it, but in every single case, they were spies directly selling secrets to foreign intelligence agencies. This idea that NSA secrets would become publicly leaked was simply not something that was within the realm of anyone's experience, because it had never actually happened before. And the main cipher that we were using was the data encryption standard, which was about 2 decades old at that point, 56-bit keys, and relatively slow to encrypt in bulk in software. So you could put DES in software, but really it was designed to be implemented in hardware. So in 1993, what everybody kind of understood intuitively was that cryptography was special. It wasn't widely used. There wasn't really a wide need for it because most communication was over wire lines. Tapping a communications link would involve, actually getting access to the wires, which was, who could do that? Getting access to stored data on a computer would involve physically burglarizing the computer and stealing the disk, which is, possible, but it's certainly not something you could remotely do over the cloud, because the cloud in 1993 was a weather feature. It wasn't a place to store your data. So, attacks on communication meant physical wiretapping, and attacks against stored data meant, for the most part, actual physical access. And, because almost nothing was connected full-time to the internet, except for big server machines at companies that were sort of, still a little bit on the margins. You could put a PCMCIA card as the main coprocessor interface on your 15-pound laptop, and you had a special briefcase for your laptop because it was so big, heavy, clunky, and fragile. So the world, it definitely predated the cell phone and pocket computing, and more importantly, it predated wireless and this idea that computing would be so heavily integrated into our lives. So what am I getting to? So the 1990s were a really important time in our history because it was just before everything got so big that you couldn't change it. The basic standards for the internet already existed from the late 70s and 1980s. The 1990s were when most of these standards were being finalized, and in particular, that was when almost all of the cryptography and security standards were being developed from the start, and our assumptions were rapidly changing. Hardware was becoming much faster. Cryptography and software was starting to become a real possibility by 1993, even though historically it had been something that you really needed hardware for. By 1993, we were starting to see that it was practical to use general-purpose computers to do cryptography. So if Clipper, requiring all of our cryptography to use not only hardware, but particularly expensive hardware based on a classified chip that in 1992, $1993 cost about $25 a pop. So it would add $25 just for the chip itself, not to mention the additional engineering cost of including it. So if you wanted to include encryption, and Clipper was what you had, you basically had a choice between not including encryption and including what was guaranteed to be expensive marginal cost encryption. And that might have seemed like a reasonable thing because historically we had always used hardware to do encryption, around 1993. But by 1994 or 1995, that was pretty plainly ridiculous. We would mostly have to continue using wireline connections for anything requiring security because our Wi-Fi connections, which mostly didn't exist yet, our cell phones, which only rich and self-important people had, wouldn't be able to support encryption. Our web sessions, which hadn't been invented yet, wouldn't have HTTPS or SSL encryptions protecting them. And pretty much everything else we used for communication, it would never occur to anybody to integrate encryption as a standard required part of the standard. It's also likely that AT&T would still be in business. AT&T in its form that existed back then would still be in business. And a big part of its business would be selling expensive NSA-approved telephones. So maybe that's a good thing. I'd still be working at Bell Labs had Clipper been successful, and it would still be a great job because this company would have had more money to spend on research because it would just be making money hand over fist selling crazy expensive encryption phones to everyone who needed them. So we are, let me stop this. I just want to point out we are equally ignorant today of what the future in 20 to 30 years will look like as we were in 1993 about what 2021 would look like. The standards we're developing today, just as the standards that we developed in the 1990s are being used in 2021, the standards we're developing in the 2020s are going to be with us in the 2050s. So, I want to urge us to be very, very cautious and very humble about our ignorance and what we're imposing on technologies that haven't been invented yet. The current debate has shifted to scanning of encrypted data before it gets encrypted to see if it has CSAM imagery. That's currently, the hot debate du jour. So what if that debate gets settled and we invent a standard for doing that today in 2021, based on all of the assumptions about what the world looks like from a technological and social point of view in 2021. Are those decisions and those assumptions still going to be valid in 2051? I suspect we will regret embedding anything today into those standards going that much farther. So I think I have a few minutes for people to ask questions or make comments or give me a hard time.
Thanks so much, Matt. I invite those in the room to join me in applause. I think you can hear us. We're so not used to clapping anymore. We've been in virtual rooms for way too long. Silicon Flatirons has what we call the Phil Weiser rule after our founder, where we always invite a student to ask the first question. I believe we have Taylor here to ask a first question of you, and I'll invite her up, and I'm going to step back to give her the podium. Hello, thank you so much for that. My name's Taylor.
Hi.
Okay, thank you. Taylor Hartley, I am an MBA candidate. I was also a cryptologist for 8 years within the Navy. I worked at NSA. I worked at NSA during all the Snowden stuff too, lots of fun. But now I'm in the commercial sector, and I have noticed that the government is switching to the cloud for data storage. And I just wanted to know if you could, maybe give me some pros and cons of what do you think encryption has to move with the cloud? What's that going to look like? Is this going to be better or worse? Just any opinion you have?
Well, so, let me make two very kind of obvious observations. The first is that the cloud can't exist without cryptography. If you don't have high confidence in your ability to secure data, putting it on, random servers somewhere out there on the internet, getting replicated however many times, is simply just not viable. So, there are all sorts of economic and reliability benefits to the cloud. There are also some disadvantages, but, people seem to really like the ability to do this. In particular, outsourcing system administration for servers to people who can do it at scale is economically very sensible for small and medium-sized entities and even large things like the government. But you simply can't get that benefit if you don't trust that your data is secure. So unless we have not just encryption highly available, but encryption that we really trust, that we trust just as much as we would if we had complete control over that data locally, we just can't have the cloud. The cloud followed the availability of strong, ubiquitously available encryption. The second is, I don't think the cloud is such an unconditional benefit as we often think it is. One of the problems, and this isn't a security problem, but it's rather a reliability problem, is that we have kind of lost in small and medium-sized enterprises the expertise to manage things locally. We're utterly dependent on outsourcing servers and outsourcing big parts of our IT because that expertise is just not available locally at small scale. If the cloud services go down, you probably don't have somebody on staff who can stand up something locally. So, it's still not without risks, but those risks aren't so much confidentiality as they are, reliability and availability and recovery. So.
Not seeing anything in the Q&A. I think we have time though for one more, and I'm going to take moderator's privilege here, Matt, because you started with 3 crypto wars on your slide, and then went on to talk about what you called the grand crypto war, number 1, which we didn't know what to number, but you referenced crypto war 3 as the war to end all crypto wars, if you remember back. Do you think that's true? Or will there be a crypto war 4? Because you seem swimming in your presentation.
I'm trying to be a combination of optimistic and pessimistic here. I'm optimistic because I can't handle a 4th crypto war. Just the thought of that is just too horrible to contemplate. I'm hoping that whenever it happens, I'll either be retired or dead. But also, I think this crypto war has the potential to be incredibly destructive because, if anything, things are moving more rapidly than they were back during the first crypto war, back during the 1990s. We're having an acceleration of the way technology is moving. And, anything where we normalize and include in standards, client-side mandates for scanning data is, aside from the risk of direct misuse or the risk of technical error, the risk that that's just going to be incompatible with future innovation is, I think, one of the hardest to talk about, but it's one of the most serious to worry about because we won't know what we lost. If there's some huge data leak, at least, we find out that there's been a disaster. But, had Clipper been successful, we wouldn't have the cloud, we wouldn't have the secure web. Cell phones would have to have this, extra chip hardware in them. And, we wouldn't know that that wasn't normal.
So we do have one more minute, and there's a question in the chat I've been alerted to from Simon Krause. Has CALIA achieved, CALIA is the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, for those of you who don't know the acronym. Has CALIA achieved in some part what the Clipper chip failed to do?
So, CALIA actually happened at about the same time as the Clipper chip. They were roughly simultaneous, and they were concerned with different things. CALIA is much less relevant than it was at the time, because at the time CALIA was passed, voice telephony was the way people communicated, and fax machines and so on. To a large extent, a lot of the communications that were envisioned under CALIA have been supplanted by internet communications that mostly are encrypted today. So I think I think actually not.
Well, we are at time. Thank you so much for such a great presentation to open our day. Thanks for joining us and tuning in.
Oh, thanks for having me. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to hearing the